The camp was nestled among Tennessee pines, their branches bowed under a light crust of frost. To the women who had been marched, ferried, and herded across continents, the silence was eerie. No gunfire, no air raid sirens, just wind, and the distant call of crows. They had been captured in France months earlier, part of a communications unit retreating through ruined towns. Most were young, barely 20, and had spent the last years behind switchboards and radio desks, sending coded messages into the air for men who never came back. Now their hands, once trained to key transmissions, were put to washing dishes and sewing torn American uniforms. Helga Ritter, once a wireless operator in Munich, stared often at the sky. "It's strange," she murmured one morning to her bunkmate, Liesel. "Here, the air is free, but we cannot send anything into it." The Americans treated them with a detached civility. They were the girls, as one sergeant called them. They worked hard, caused no trouble, and in return were given warm food and wool blankets. But to the women, captivity was its own kind of silence. In the center of the camp, near the mess hall, stood a small wooden shack filled with confiscated equipment, radios, typewriters, cracked telephones. The women sometimes passed it on their way to work, glancing at the door as if it were a shrine to a lost world. None of them knew that, inside that shack, an American technician named Corporal James Harper was working on something that would change everything. The shack was the heart of the camp's mystery. It stood slightly apart from the barracks, its wooden slats weathered gray by southern rain, a small antenna rising crookedly from its roof. The guards never said what was inside. The German women guessed it was for intelligence, perhaps radio interception, perhaps coded messages. To Helga, the faint hum from within was both a torment and a comfort. One day, while carrying laundry past the fence, she caught a glimpse through the slightly ajar door. Inside, an American soldier sat hunched over a workbench, headphones pressed to his ears. A radio glowed faintly before him, the kind she recognized immediately, a shortwave transmitter, its tuning dial catching the light like a jewel. That evening in the barracks, she couldn't keep quiet. "They have working sets," she whispered to Liesel. "Proper receivers. Collins' model may be newer." Liesel frowned. "And what good is that to us? We're not allowed near them." Helga hesitated. "No, but imagine hearing something. German words. Music. Anything from home." The thought alone ached like hunger. Since capture, none of them had heard their language outside their own whispers. The war had cut sound itself into territories, theirs and the enemy's. The next morning, Helga was assigned to clean near the shack. As she worked, she hummed softly, an old Bavarian song about spring. To her shock, the door opened. The same American, tall and narrow-shouldered, stepped out holding a bundle of wire. He stopped. "You sing German," he said awkwardly, in English tinged with curiosity rather than accusation. Helga froze. "Ah, yes." He looked past her, then back. "My grandmother sang that too." Then he walked off, leaving her breathless in the cold air, her heart pounding like a drum against her ribs. That night, she lay awake long after lights out, the faint hum of that radio echoing in her memory. Somewhere beyond the Atlantic, she thought, her mother might still be listening too. 2 nights later, Helga couldn't sleep. The barracks were a chorus of restless breathing, of whispered dreams in German, of the soft cough of someone feverish near the stove. The rain had returned, drumming against the tin roof like distant gunfire. She slipped out quietly, wrapping a thin blanket around her shoulders. The guards at the far post were distracted, sharing a cigarette beneath the dim halo of a lantern. The path to the shack was a slick ribbon of mud, and each step felt like crossing a forbidden border. When she reached the side of the shack, she pressed her ear to the wall. The hum was there again, soft, alive, and constant. Then, through the hiss and static, a faint melody emerged. She froze. It wasn't an American voice. It wasn't English. It was German. Lily Marlene. The song drifted through the air like a ghost from another life. The old wartime ballad, every soldier, every nurse, every lover separated by distance knew it. For a moment she forgot where she was. She was back in Hamburg, dancing with her brother in their kitchen, her mother humming along, the windows open to the summer rain. Her throat tightened. Then, behind her, a voice said, "You shouldn't be here." She turned. The American from before stood a few feet away, coat unbuttoned, rain dripping from his hair. He didn't raise his rifle or shout. He just looked tired. "I only wanted to listen," she whispered. He hesitated. Then, with a sigh, he pushed the door open and motioned for her to come in. Inside, the room glowed faintly from the tubes of the radio. The air smelled of oil and hot dust. He turned a dial carefully, clearing the static until the singer's voice grew clearer. "Berlin broadcast," he murmured. "I don't jam these at night. I figure someone out there needs to hear home too." Helga's eyes filled. For the first time since capture, she didn't feel like a prisoner. She felt human again, fragile, breakable, alive. And beside her, the enemy was listening to the same song. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The radio filled the small room with warmth, the kind of warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. It came from memory, from the ache of a song that crossed borders, languages, and uniforms. When the record ended, only static remained. The American reached forward and slowly turned the volume down until the world was quiet again. The storm outside rumbled distantly. Helga stood there, unsure whether to thank him or apologize. She had never been this close to an American soldier before, not without fear or anger clinging to her. His face was worn, a faint scar on his chin, eyes that looked as though they'd seen too much to still believe in victory. He broke the silence first. "My name's Jack." "Helga," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. Jack nodded once, as though memorizing it. "You were a nurse?" She hesitated. "Yes. Field hospital near Aachen, before they told us to surrender." "I figured," he said. "You treat people the way soldiers never can." The words caught her off guard. No one had spoken to her like that since the war began, not as an enemy, not as a number, but as a person. Jack handed her a small tin cup. "Coffee?" It was lukewarm and far too sweet, but to her, it tasted like the life she'd forgotten. Her hands trembled slightly as she drank. She could feel the tension melting out of her shoulders, replaced by a strange, unsteady calm. "You miss home," he said quietly. She looked at him. "Don't you?" He smiled faintly, but there was pain in it. "Every day. But out here, home's just a sound. Sometimes a song like that one." The rain had stopped. The quiet between them wasn't awkward, it was sacred, a truce made without words. When she finally left the shack, Helga looked back. Jack hadn't moved. He was still sitting by the radio, hand resting on the dial, as if keeping the song alive for anyone still listening in the dark. And though she never said it aloud, she knew something inside her had shifted, not because of mercy or food or comfort, but because of silence shared between two souls who should have hated each other. Over the following days, Helga found herself drawn repeatedly to the shack. Jack never forbade her, never hinted at impropriety. He simply worked on his radios, headphones clamped over his ears, while she lingered in the doorway, pretending to inspect wires or sweep the floor. Sometimes he spoke softly, teaching her simple adjustments to the dials, and she listened, fascinated. Every lesson was tinged with an unspoken agreement. This was a temporary truce, fragile as frost on pine needles, but real. The other German women noticed her absence from chores and questioned her. Liesel tugged at her sleeve one morning, concern and jealousy mingling in her eyes. "Where do you go, Helga?" she whispered. Helga shrugged, fumbling for an excuse. "Just tidying up near the shack. The mess hall needs it." Liesel didn't press further, but Helga sensed the unspoken accusations in her fellow prisoners' glances. Curiosity, perhaps envy, though Helga herself couldn't explain why she was compelled to return. One evening, Jack invited her inside after a long day. Rain had begun again, and the camp was slick with mud. The low hum of the transmitter was the only sound, punctuated by the occasional pop of static. "I want to show you something," he said, gesturing to a small wooden box atop the workbench. Inside lay a collection of phonograph records, each labeled with a neat hand. "Music?" Helga asked, astonished. "From all over Europe," Jack replied. "I tried to get a record for anyone who might need to hear home." His eyes lingered on hers, and for a moment the war, the uniforms, the fences, all faded into irrelevance. Helga felt an odd warmth spread through her chest. The soldiers in camp were still enemies. The officers still had orders. But here, in the dim light of this shack, there were simply two people, listening, learning, remembering. He set a record on the turntable, Schubert, a leader Helga recognized immediately. The soft piano and tender voice wrapped around her, each note carrying her across the Atlantic to her family's parlor in Munich. Jack adjusted the volume, careful not to let the others hear. "I figured you might need this," he murmured. Helga's throat tightened. She wanted to speak, to tell him everything, the fear, the hunger, the endless march, but no words were enough. Instead, she sat and listened, letting the music carry the hours away. Outside, the wind rattled the wooden slats of the shack, but inside, time was a fragile cocoon. She realized that Jack's gesture, small, forbidden, simple, was a lifeline. Not mercy, not leniency, but recognition. Someone saw her as human. When the record ended, silence fell heavy between them. Helga felt the weight of it all, the years, the loss, the war, but also an unfamiliar sense of possibility. Perhaps the world could be rebuilt, one small act of understanding at a time. Jack finally broke the silence. "You should go back before someone notices." Helga nodded, hesitant, reluctant to leave the warmth of the shack and the fragile connection it offered. But as she stepped into the night, the pine needles wet beneath her boots, she felt it, something new, a fragile thread of hope, stretching across the divide the war had forced upon them. The following morning, Helga returned to her routine in the camp with a peculiar sense of lightness. She washed dishes, folded laundry, and swept the barracks, but her thoughts kept drifting to the shack, to Jack, and to the music that had lingered in her mind through the night. Each mundane task seemed slightly more bearable with the memory of Schubert's voice hovering like a ghost across the Tennessee pines. Yet, the reality of captivity soon reminded her of its unyielding grip. The camp was not a sanctuary. Guards patrolled the fences with rifles slung across their shoulders, counting steps and menacing the prisoners with the discipline of authority. The other German women eyed her curiously, whispering in low tones when they thought she wasn't listening. Rumors were spreading about the shack and the American who allowed her near it. Helga's proximity drew suspicion and envy, and she felt an acute awareness of being watched. Still, she returned again that evening, walking cautiously through the muddy paths, her breath visible in the cold air. Jack was waiting, headphones pushed back, his hands busy with wires and soldering iron. He didn't scold her for coming. Instead, he smiled faintly. "You're persistent," he said, a note of amusement in his voice. "Or desperate." "Both," Helga admitted, ducking under the low doorway. The room smelled of dust, oil, and faintly of warmth that no tent or blanket in the camp could provide. Jack handed her a coil of wire. "Help me with this," he said. He explained patiently how to strip the insulation, how to solder the ends without burning the copper. Helga followed his instructions carefully, fascinated by the rhythm and focus required. It was the first time in months she felt useful in a world that was not governed by orders from unseen officers or the cruel randomness of war. As they worked, a static-filled melody hummed softly from the transmitter. Jack leaned close to the dial, and the German voice of a radio announcer emerged. It was a news broadcast from back home, fragmented, outdated, but unmistakably familiar. Helga's chest tightened, a mix of relief and longing. She recognized street names, cities, and the cadence of her mother tongue, each word a small anchor to a life she feared was lost. Jack glanced at her, reading the emotion on her face. "You miss it," he said quietly. Helga nodded, unable to find words. She didn't just miss home, she missed the certainty of a life before war, before defeat, before capture. For the first time, the boundaries between enemy and ally blurred. Here, amid radios and wires, in a shack that neither belonged to her nor to him, they shared a fragment of humanity the war could not touch. Helga realized that in this small, forbidden corner of the world, she had found a space where being herself, fragile, frightened, but alive, was enough. By the time she returned to the barracks, darkness had fallen completely. The camp seemed larger, lonelier, but also somehow quieter. Helga carried with her a small spark, a reminder that even in captivity, music, connection, and the simplest gestures could transcend the fences, the uniforms, and the hostilities that otherwise defined their lives. Over the next few days, Helga's visits to the shack became a quiet ritual. She would slip out after the evening roll call, careful not to attract the attention of the guards, and find Jack immersed in his work. Sometimes it was repairing radios, sometimes tuning the transmitter, sometimes simply listening to faint, crackling signals from Europe. Each visit left her with a fragile sense of hope, as though the world beyond the barbed wire and pine trees still existed, humming faintly through the static. One evening, a storm rolled in, heavier than any before. Rain hammered the camp, turning paths into rivers of mud. Helga pressed against the shack door, hesitant to step inside, but the soft glow from the tubes beckoned her. Jack looked up, his hair damp, eyes weary, yet he gestured her in without a word. The room smelled of rain and solder, a strange comfort that felt like a home she had long forgotten. "This storm," Helga began. "It's everywhere. I can feel it in my bones." Jack nodded, listening to the patter of rain on the tin roof. He adjusted a dial, and suddenly a voice broke through the static, soft, fragile, yet unmistakably German. It was a young woman singing a lullaby from Munich, words Helga had heard as a child. She closed her eyes, letting the melody seep into her skin. It was as if the war, the camp, and even the miles of ocean separating her from home, were momentarily suspended. Jack leaned back, quietly observing her. "It's not perfect, not even complete, but sometimes..." His voice trailed off. "Sometimes it's enough." Helga turned to him, her hands still trembling from the rain and the emotion. "Enough?" she asked. "Enough to remember you're alive," Jack replied simply. "Enough to know the world isn't just this camp, or this war." The words struck her harder than any reprimand or comfort she had received in months. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine a life beyond the fences, beyond uniforms, beyond fear. A life where the sun didn't burn her eyes with guilt, where laughter wasn't a dangerous luxury, and where music could be more than a memory. That night, back in the barracks, Helga hummed the lullaby quietly under her breath. Liesl noticed but said nothing, only watching her with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Helga didn't explain. There were no words to convey the fragile bridge she had found between herself and the world beyond the camp. The weeks that followed saw subtle changes. The camp continued its rigid schedule, the guards remained watchful, yet the shack became a sanctuary, a small place of neutrality. Helga and Jack shared more than music. They shared stories of childhoods, fleeting glances of home, even recipes for dishes that had become ghosts in memory. And in that quiet, tenuous way, trust began to grow. Not the trust of generals or captains, but the trust of two human beings who had been carved out of opposing worlds, finding fragments of themselves in each other's presence. One morning, a shipment arrived at the camp, parcels marked with red crosses, boxes of chocolate, dried fruit, and letters from home. The guards moved the packages quickly, but Helga caught sight of one addressed to the shack, marked with Jack's name. She slipped inside after her chores, curiosity piqued. Jack opened the parcel with careful hands. Inside were small tokens from home. Photographs, a knitted scarf, a letter from his sister, and a stack of German-language newspapers. Helga's heart lurched as she realized that here, in the middle of Tennessee, the outside world was still reaching them. "Do you ever read these?" Helga asked softly, trying not to let the emotion in her voice show. Jack glanced at her, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Every day. They're reminders that there's life beyond this fence, beyond this war." You know, hope in small packages. Helga studied the photographs, black and white images of children playing in sunlit streets, women selling flowers in markets, men laughing at cafes. It seemed unreal, almost as if the world she remembered from before the war had become a dream. Later that day, she returned to her chores, carrying with her a sliver of warmth. Even among the monotony of camp life, there was a thread connecting her to something larger than herself, larger than the uniforms and the cold discipline. She realized that the shack, Jack, and the small parcels of home were forming a lifeline, a bridge not just between nations, but between despair and the faint glimmer of hope. That evening, she hummed the lullaby again, this time adding a verse she had forgotten. Jack was listening when she entered the shack, eyes half closed, hands fiddling with wires. "You're singing again," he said quietly. I remembered a line," Helga admitted. "I hadn't thought of it in years." He nodded, letting her words hang in the air. No judgment, no pretense, only quiet understanding. For the first time since her capture, Helga felt a fragile sense of continuity, as though her life hadn't been entirely severed by the war. The weeks passed, and the camp fell into a rhythm. Work, meals, roll calls, and the quiet hours by the shack. The radios continued to hum, broadcasting voices from distant lands, carrying news, music, and the occasional coded message. Helga learned to listen, to catch fragments of language and meaning, letting them stitch together a fragile tapestry of the world outside the barbed wire. One afternoon, a new group of prisoners arrived, women from France, Poland, and Italy. They were younger, more frightened, and utterly disoriented by the strange calm of the Tennessee camp. Helga, now more confident, guided them quietly through the routines, showing them where to wash, where to line up for meals, and where the shack was. "They sing songs from home," she explained to one of the French women, a trembling girl barely 16. "Listen carefully, and you might feel alive again." And so, the shack became a sanctuary not only for Helga and Jack but for anyone who needed a whisper of the world beyond the war, a place where music, memory, and human kindness transcended nationality, duty, and fear. Winter deepened, and the Tennessee pines grew heavy with frost. The mornings were bitter, the breath of the prisoners and guards alike forming clouds that lingered over the ground. Yet inside the camp, life had settled into a fragile pattern: work in the barracks, meals that tasted more of routine than nourishment, and evenings spent near the shack, where the radio hummed and brought fragments of the world to their ears. Helga found herself returning there each night, drawn by the warmth and the faint glow of the tubes. Jack had begun to teach her how to tune the dials, how to coax clearer signals out of static, and even how to send short, coded responses. It was thrilling and terrifying. To communicate beyond the camp meant risk, but it also meant connection. One evening, as snow fell lightly, dusting the fences and barracks, Helga sat on the floor beside Jack. He was tuning a small transmitter when a clear, deliberate voice broke through the static. It was German, speaking in clipped tones. "Hier spricht Hamburg. Empfang in Tennessee, Antwerpen See." Helga's heart raced. Hamburg. Home. Her fingers trembled as she scribbled notes, translating Jack's English explanations into her own careful German responses. Do you understand what it says?" Jack asked, eyes wide. "Yes," Helga breathed. It's someone listening for any German voices outside Germany. Perhaps a friend, perhaps someone from home." They took turns responding, a slow, delicate exchange carried on waves of static and courage. Each message felt like a thread connecting the present with a world she feared she'd lost forever. For Helga, it wasn't just radio, it was survival, memory, and defiance woven together. News of the radio exchange spread quietly among the women. They gathered, shy at first, then with growing wonder, to listen. French, Polish, and Italian prisoners, who understood little of German, leaned close and felt the resonance of a language that still lived, even far from its homeland. Helga realized that through the radio, boundaries blurred. The camp, the fences, the barbed wire, all became less formidable. Through voices carried on invisible waves, They could touch a part of life that no war could steal. That night, after the signals faded into static, Helga lingered by the shack, staring at the stars above the pine trees. Jack came to sit beside her, offering a steaming cup of coffee. "You're different," he said quietly. "More alive than when you first came here." Helga smiled faintly, the snow crunching under her boots as she stood. "Perhaps," she said. "Or perhaps the world is only beginning to remember me again." The radio hummed softly in the background, a heartbeat of possibility, carrying with it the faint promise that life, even here, could be reclaimed one song, one message, one quiet moment at a time. The days grew longer, but the cold remained relentless. Work continued in the barracks, but evenings at the shack became the highlight of Helga's existence. Each night, she and Jack experimented with frequencies, exchanging greetings with voices from Germany, France, and even distant American cities. The small group of prisoners began to gather around the shack after chores, listening in hushed awe, realizing that the world they'd thought lost to war was still reaching for them. One evening, a familiar German melody filtered through the static. "Die Lorelei," Helga whispered, breathless, as the voice of a distant radio announcer sang the haunting ballad. Her fingers hovered over the keys, her heart hammering with longing. She realized how desperately she had craved sound, not commands, not orders, but something alive, human, and true. Jack noticed her hesitation. "You want to respond?" he asked softly. "Yes," Helga replied, almost in a whisper. "But I don't know if it's safe." Jack shook his head. "We'll be careful. Short messages. Nothing traceable." Helga's fingers flew over the keys, sending a few deliberate words. "Here Helga, Tennessee. Ich hör. Alice Gut. Here Helga, Tennessee. I listen. All is well." She hesitated, listening as the static swallowed her voice. And then, faintly, the reply came back. A life had answered her. Someone had heard her. The bond between her and Jack deepened. He spoke little of the war itself, his letters to his family left unmentioned, but in their shared work, they built something quieter, more enduring: trust. The camp became less a place of confinement, and more a place of discovery. Other prisoners began noticing the changes. Liesel, who had always been cautious and timid, lingered near the shack, watching Helga work, her curiosity piqued. "Can it really be from home?" she asked one night. Helga nodded. "Sometimes, yes. And sometimes it's even more. Music, news, voices we thought gone. It's proof that the world isn't finished with us yet." Even the guards, distant and indifferent as they were, seemed to accept the radio's presence. They walked past without comment, perhaps sensing that this small human act, voices reaching across oceans, was outside their control. One afternoon, a package arrived for Jack from a friend in New York, a small, delicate microphone and a set of spare tubes for the transmitter. He unwrapped it with care, and Helga's eyes widened. "We can send clearer messages now?" Jack smiled faintly. "Not just clearer. More alive. You'll see." That night, the shack was alive with sound. Through crackle and hiss, German voices greeted them, shared news, sang songs. Liesel, standing beside Helga, quietly hummed along with the melodies. For the first time in months, Helga felt something almost impossible: hope. She realized, in that moment, that this fragile bridge of radio waves, this secret pulse of life, was a rebellion of its own. Against fear, against silence, against the isolation of war itself. Winter tightened its grip over the camp. Frost glazed the pine needles, and every breath left Helga's lungs in visible clouds. Yet inside the shack, warmth persisted, not from fire, but from the hum of the radio and the quiet companionship of Jack. The broadcasts became more ambitious. Jack taught Helga to identify the frequencies of Allied transmissions carrying coded messages, weather updates, and even music from orchestras she had only dreamed of hearing. Helga's fingers grew nimble over the keys, and her confidence blossomed. For a fleeting moment, the war outside seemed to recede, leaving only the room, the radio, and the fragile camaraderie forming between captor and captive. One evening, a faintly accented voice broke through the static. A woman's voice, clear and lyrical, sang a German folk song Helga had learned as a child. Helga pressed her hand to her mouth, tears forming unbidden. "It's Frau Müller, she's on the Berlin broadcast," she whispered. Jack leaned close, his breath warm against her ear. "Then she hears you too." Helga nodded, barely speaking. The knowledge that someone on the other side of the ocean knew she was alive, that her voice had reached them, was intoxicating. Each transmission became a ritual, a lifeline threading across continents, bridging enemies and allies alike. The other prisoners began to notice the change in Helga. Where once she had moved through the barracks with quiet resignation, she now carried a subtle lightness, a purpose beyond mere survival. Liesel watched her one evening, curiosity mingled with admiration. "Do you think they know we're here?" she asked cautiously. Helga shook her head. "It doesn't matter. They hear us not as prisoners, but as humans. That's enough." Yet even amid this fragile serenity, tension lingered. Some of the older prisoners murmured that the Americans might discover their nightly visits to the shack and punish them. Helga felt the weight of this possibility, but each night she returned, driven by the music and the fleeting conversations that reminded her of home. Then one night, the signal faltered. The static crackled ominously, and a harsh American voice cut through the melody. "All clear, Jack. You know the rules. No messages beyond the camp perimeter." Jack's shoulders stiffened, and Helga's heart sank. "We've been careful," he said softly. "I know," the voice replied. "But the higher-ups are watching. You too, keep it subtle. Only music, nothing else." Helga understood immediately. Even in the fragile sanctuary they had created, danger was never far. The war outside had not paused for music or longing. Yet she also realized that what they were doing, hearing home, sharing humanity, was too precious to abandon. That night, Helga hummed softly along with the faint strains of a German lullaby, the radio echoing her own voice back at her. Jack sat beside her, quietly listening. Outside, the frost glinted in the weak moonlight, but inside, warmth persisted. For the first time, Helga understood that freedom could exist in moments, even if the world beyond the fence remained a prison. Days passed in a rhythm dictated by routine, frost, and the distant hum of engines beyond the camp. Helga and Jack grew accustomed to their nightly sessions, sharing silence, songs, and small bits of conversation that skirted the edge of trust. The other prisoners began to notice Helga's quiet energy, a spark that had returned after months of resignation. One morning, as Helga carried bundles of laundry to the mess hall, she spotted a group of American guards arguing with another corporal near the shack. Their voices carried through the thin walls, sharp and tense. Helga's stomach clenched. She quickened her pace but couldn't help catching snippets of the argument. "Too many nights, they could be signaling." Her pulse quickened. She knew immediately, the broadcasts were at risk of discovery. That night she returned to the shack with a heavy heart, finding Jack hunched over the radio. "Did you hear?" she whispered. Jack nodded, running a hand over his short-cropped hair. "We'll have to be careful. No mistakes now." The next evening, Helga approached the shack cautiously, boots crunching over frost-hardened earth. She held a small notebook in her hand, filled with musical notations and German phrases she had overheard in broadcasts. Inside, Jack was already adjusting the dials, his face tense. "We'll keep it to music only," he said, his voice low. "No messages, no hints. Just melodies." Helga nodded, her fingers hovering over the keys. They played a few notes, tentative and soft, then settled into an old German waltz. As the melody drifted into the night, Helga felt her heart lift despite the shadow of fear. For these hours, they could exist outside the war, in a place where song erased borders and uniforms. Over the following weeks, the two developed a silent rhythm, a language of gestures and glances. Jack would nod toward a frequency, Helga would adjust the dial, and the music would flow. Sometimes she hummed along, sometimes he hummed quietly in reply. The small room became their universe, where years of distrust and hatred were replaced by something fragile yet undeniable: understanding. Then one night, as Helga fine-tuned a soft rendition of Lily Marlene, Jack paused. Do you want to hear something else?" he asked, hesitantly. He reached into a pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph, an image of his family in Ohio, smiling on a summer porch. Helga's eyes widened. "Your home?" Jack nodded. "I thought, maybe you'd like to know who listens with me." She studied the faces in the photograph, the simple warmth of a life untouched by this war. For the first time, Helga realized that behind the radio, behind the shack, behind the uniforms, were people like her, people who longed for home, for music, for connection. That night, they played quietly, sharing stories in fragmented English and broken German, bridging years of conflict with song, laughter, and cautious smiles. For a fleeting moment, the frost outside and the war beyond the fence ceased to exist. Helga returned to her bunk that night, notebook clutched to her chest, her mind alive with melodies, memories, and the knowledge that humanity could survive even here, in a place designed to strip it away. The days grew shorter, and the frost hardened into ice along the edges of the barracks. Yet the shack remained a place of warmth, its small lamp casting a golden halo over the cluttered radio equipment. Helga found herself drawn there each night, not just for the music, but for the quiet companionship Jack offered. One evening, as snow began to fall lightly, Jack was adjusting the dials when Helga arrived with her notebook. "I found something," she said, opening it to a page filled with scribbled notes. "A song my mother used to hum when I was small. It always made the long winter seem shorter." Jack leaned over, reading the German script. "Teach me?" he asked softly. Helga hesitated, then nodded. Slowly, she hummed the melody, letting it rise and fall like the wind through the pines. Jack tried to mimic it, off-key at first, then catching the rhythm. They laughed quietly, careful not to disturb the camp. For a few precious moments, the walls, the fences, the war, all disappeared, replaced by music and human connection. The following week, the camp received new orders. Helga and the other German women were to assist with kitchen duties in the mess hall full-time. At first, Helga worried she would lose access to the shack, but Jack had anticipated it. He had hidden a small receiver in a crate beneath spare blankets, allowing her to continue listening even while carrying out her chores. One afternoon, while scrubbing pots in the steamy kitchen, she caught a snippet of German words on the radio, a voice singing a lullaby she had not heard since leaving Munich. She froze, heart hammering. "It's coming from the shack," she whispered to a fellow prisoner. The woman shook her head. She didn't understand. Helga smiled faintly. It didn't matter. She could hear it, and it was enough. That night, after her chores, she slipped to the shack. Jack was already there, listening intently, a small smile on his face. "You did well today," he said, nodding. "They didn't suspect a thing?" "No," Helga replied, adjusting the receiver. "Music travels far when no one is listening." As they worked together, a quiet tension settled over them. Not fear, not suspicion, but something gentler, unspoken. They were two people, strangers by circumstance but companions by choice, discovering that the smallest acts, sharing a song, a smile, a cup of coffee, could carry them across oceans and through frost. Weeks passed in this rhythm, punctuated by letters and supplies from the Red Cross. Helga's morale lifted with every note, every shared moment. And for the first time since the war had begun, she allowed herself to imagine a future, one in which music, laughter, and human kindness could exist outside the shadows of fear and obedience. The shack became a sanctuary, a place where enemy and captive met on equal ground. And Helga, standing by the glowing tubes of the radio, realized that even in a world defined by conflict, she had found a small, unshakable piece of peace. Winter deepened, and the camp settled into a monotonous rhythm. Frost clung to the pine needles, and each morning, the women woke to the sharp bite of cold air and the crunch of ice underfoot. Yet the shack remained a sanctuary, a place where Helga could shed the weight of uniform and orders and simply listen. One evening, Jack handed her a small, folded piece of paper. "It's a broadcast schedule," he said. "Mostly music, news, messages from home. Some German, some English." His eyes lingered on hers, hesitant. "I thought you might want to know when to tune in." Helga took it, tracing the lines with her fingers. The schedule was precise, marked with scribbles and notes, frequencies, times, even little doodles Jack had made to remember which stations were live. She felt a surge of gratitude, mingled with a fluttering sense of something more. That night she tuned her receiver to a faint German broadcast. The voice of a singer drifted through the static, soft and clear, bringing memories of her family, of city streets lined with familiar shops and the smell of fresh bread. Helga's throat tightened. She had not heard her language spoken aloud outside the camp for months. Tears pricked her eyes. Jack noticed, silently pressing a hand to her shoulder. "It's okay," he murmured. "You can cry here." She shook her head, wiping at her eyes. "I didn't realize how much I needed it." Days turned into weeks. Helga found herself sharing the shack with other German women when Jack wasn't there. They would huddle around the small receiver, listening to broadcasts in their own language, whispering translations for those less fluent. The sound of German became a lifeline, a tether to the world they had been torn from, and to the parts of themselves they feared had been lost. Jack watched from the doorway sometimes, silently acknowledging the fragile autonomy they had carved in the midst of captivity. He had seen soldiers hardened by war softened by music, and women hardened by fear softened by memory. The shack was a bridge, between enemy and captive, between the past and a possible future. One evening, as snow swirled outside and the fire in the stove sputtered, Helga and Jack sat side by side, listening to a German symphony. Helga hummed along softly, feeling the notes vibrate through her chest, the warmth spreading like sunlight in frozen earth. Jack leaned closer, whispering, "Someday, this will all be over. And the songs, they'll still be here." Helga nodded, unsure if she believed it fully, but comforted by the idea. The radio hummed, a soft pulse against the hush of winter. In that moment, the war's reach felt distant, and the human heart, capable of memory, music, and small acts of grace, felt infinite. The shack, the song, the quiet companionship, they were proof that life could endure even in the shadow of conflict. Spring arrived slowly, teasing the Tennessee pines with hints of green and the soft smell of thawing earth. The camp, which had seemed frozen in time, began to stir with renewed energy. Snow melted into mud, and the women walked carefully along slippery paths to the mess hall or the latrine, their boots leaving deep impressions in the wet soil. Helga noticed subtle changes in the atmosphere. Guards smiled more often, conversations lingered longer in the mess hall, and the tension that had wrapped the camp like a tight cord loosened just enough to let a small light in. Yet the shack remained the true heartbeat of connection. It was a private world in a public cage, a place where language, memory, and song intertwined. One afternoon, Jack invited Helga to help him repair a damaged transmitter. The coils were frayed, the solder cold and brittle. He handed her a small iron, explaining carefully how to warm and rejoin the wires. Helga's fingers, long used to precise motions from handling radio keys, worked quickly and confidently. For a moment, the war and the prison faded. The task was purely technical, purely human. "Not bad," Jack said, leaning back. "You've got a touch for this." Helga looked at him, realizing that for all his youth and American accent, he had become a teacher, a companion, and a witness to her survival. "It's different when it's not under fire," she said softly. Jack nodded, the faintest smile tugging at his lips. "I think people are different when there's no one watching. You don't have to be a soldier or a prisoner. You can just be." Over the following weeks, Helga found herself sneaking moments with Jack in the shack. They would share stories from home, her small apartment in Munich, his childhood in Kansas, the songs that had carried them through the early days of the war. They laughed quietly at misunderstandings in language, marveling at the similarities between their experiences despite the labels of enemy and captive. One evening, as they listened to a faint German broadcast of a lullaby, Jack spoke in a hushed tone. You know, it's strange. I never thought I'd be here, listening to this with a German nurse, thinking that maybe we're not so different after all. Helga's eyes met his, the flickering light of the lamp catching in both their gazes. Perhaps we never were, she said. Outside, the camp seemed lighter, though the distant hum of war lingered like a shadow in the trees. Inside the shack, the warmth of shared humanity blossomed in small gestures, a hand steadying another, a shared laugh, a song remembered. Helga realized that the world beyond the camp, though torn apart by conflict, could still contain these pockets of understanding. And in these moments, the fragile, improbable bridge between them, German and American, prisoner and soldier, felt unbreakable. The shack became more than a place. It became a sanctuary, a symbol that even amidst war, the human spirit could find resonance across lines of division. By late spring, the camp had transformed in small but undeniable ways. The snow had long vanished, replaced by mud-dappled paths and sprouting wildflowers along the fence lines. Birds returned, their songs breaking the monotony of distant gunfire and mechanical hums from faraway bases. Even the barracks, once austere and gray, seemed to carry a faint warmth from the thaw and from the soft camaraderie growing among the prisoners. Helga noticed a change in the women as well. Liesel now hummed German folk tunes freely, and the chatter during meals had shifted from whispers of despair to cautious curiosity. Conversations about family, favorite books, and memories of home floated alongside discussions of chores, medical routines, and work details. It was as though life, long dormant in the camp, was beginning to stretch its fingers back into their days. Jack had become a quiet fixture in Helga's life. Not a guard, not a mentor, simply a human being who shared the strange intimacy of a world caught between freedom and captivity. He taught her small technical tricks with the radios, adjusting dials, repairing fragile coils, and even soldering stubborn connections. In return, Helga would sing softly while she worked, letting the words of old Bavarian songs drift through the shack. Jack listened in quiet awe, occasionally humming along with mispronounced syllables, but always with a gentle, knowing smile. One afternoon, Helga and Jack were adjusting a new antenna outside the shack when a letter arrived from the camp's mail service. Helga tore open the envelope with trembling hands. Her heart skipped when she saw the familiar handwriting of her mother. The letter was short but filled with love and hope, describing how the small town near Munich had survived the bombing, how neighbors had rallied together, and how the family waited, praying, for news of her safe return. Tears blurred her vision as Jack handed her a clean handkerchief without a word. "It's good news," he said softly. "Yes, it is," she whispered, pressing the paper to her chest. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the pines, Helga found herself walking along the perimeter fence, clutching the letter. She paused near the shack and saw Jack tending the radios, his brow furrowed but relaxed in the golden light. He looked up and waved, and she smiled back, realizing that these small gestures had become a new language, one of trust, recognition, and perhaps something unspoken, yet deeper than words. The camp, despite its fences and its rules, felt less like a prison. The Americans, through acts of quiet humanity, allowing them to work, offering small kindnesses, and keeping the shack's radios alive, had created a space where survival was more than enduring. It was beginning to be living. Helga realized, as she returned to her bunk that night, that the war outside might never fully end. But within the small radius of that Tennessee camp, the boundaries of enemy and ally had softened. For the first time, she understood that hope could exist in the smallest moments: a song, a shared task, a glance, a letter. And for the first time in months, she slept without the gnawing ache of hopelessness in her chest. The days grew longer and warmer, the frost long melted into the sodden earth. Helga and the other German women began to feel the rhythm of the camp more acutely, not just the monotony of daily chores, but the subtle pulse of life resuming despite the war. Each morning brought the scrape of boots on the path, the clatter of breakfast trays, the low murmur of conversations in German and English alike. The camp had become a fragile ecosystem, one where the human capacity for kindness quietly thrived in the shadow of conflict. Helga found herself spending more time in the shack, adjusting receivers, testing wires, and helping Jack keep the radios in working order. Often, they worked side by side in silence, hands occasionally brushing as they passed tools. The world outside seemed to shrink to that cramped wooden room, the static of shortwave signals, and the occasional distant song from Europe the only noises that mattered. One evening, Jack set up a small record player that he had found among the camp's supplies. The needle hissed before a scratchy melody began, this time an American jazz tune. Helga listened, unfamiliar yet strangely entranced. Jack noticed her hesitation and said softly, "Music doesn't belong to any country. You can enjoy it without betraying where you come from." Helga nodded, letting the smooth rhythm fill her chest. For the first time, she laughed freely, a sound she hadn't heard herself make in months. Her laughter was mirrored by other women who had gathered around, curious and weary, yet grateful for the brief reprieve from labor and worry. The camp, so long a place of confinement, now shimmered with small moments of beauty, as if life itself refused to be fully subdued by war. The transformation, however, was not without its tension. Some women feared that too much closeness with the Americans, too much familiarity, would betray their homeland. Whispers circulated about loyalty, honor, and shame. Helga found herself torn between instinctive caution and the undeniable humanity she witnessed daily. Yet every act of kindness, the warm meal, a blanket, a gentle word, eroded those fears stitch by stitch. One afternoon, a supply plane landed, bringing news of the war's progression. Rumors of advancing fronts, retreating divisions, and shifting lines filtered through the camp. Helga read the news carefully, her heart both heavy and hopeful. Jack appeared beside her, holding a small mug of coffee. "You read too fast," he said, a faint grin tugging at his lips. "Come, drink. The world outside can wait a little while." And so they drank, watching the pines sway in the wind, their conversation limited to the mundane. The weather, the difficulty of keeping radios working, the taste of sugar and coffee. But beneath it lay the quiet acknowledgement that survival had brought them to this rare space, a fragile understanding between two worlds. Helga realized, as twilight descended, that hope was not a grand gesture but the accumulation of small, enduring acts, a song shared, a tool passed, a hand held. In that realization, she felt something she hadn't dared to feel in months, the faint, thrilling certainty that life, however tentative, could still flourish. By late autumn, the camp had settled into a rhythm that was almost peaceful. The trees surrounding the compound had shed their leaves, and a crisp chill now hung in the air, frosting the early mornings. Helga moved among the barracks and the shack with a quiet confidence she hadn't possessed before. Her hands were steady, her mind alert, yet something inside had softened. The rigid discipline, the constant fear of retribution, had given way to a cautious curiosity, a fragile openness to the world and to people she had once considered enemies. Jack remained a steady presence at the shack. They worked together daily, sometimes in silence, sometimes exchanging words that bridged languages and histories. Occasionally, he would catch her humming a German folk tune or a jazz snippet she had picked up from the Americans, and he would nod in quiet appreciation. Neither could claim the other's language fully, yet their understanding transcended words. One morning, as Helga carried bundles of laundry past the shack, she noticed a group of American and German women gathered near the mess hall. They were laughing, softly, almost cautiously, at a joke someone had made about the bitter coffee. Helga felt a warmth spread through her chest, a feeling that the impossible could exist, camaraderie between those who had been taught to hate. Later that evening, a storm rolled in over the pines. Unlike the first storms they had endured, this one brought no terror, only the steady rhythm of rain against the canvas and the smell of damp earth. Inside the shack, Helga and Jack huddled over the radio, listening to distant transmissions from Europe, fragments of voices that spoke of home, of loved ones, of cities still standing. For a moment, the war seemed far away, its violence muted by the human connection that had quietly taken root. Jack glanced at Helga. "You ever think, maybe it doesn't have to be like this?" She met his gaze. "Like what?" "Enemies. Divided worlds." Maybe there's a way to be just people. Helga smiled faintly, the corners of her mouth trembling. I think we're finding it here, in this little space, between radios and rain. The radio hummed, a final fragment of music drifting through the air. Helga closed her eyes, letting the sound fill her, letting it stitch together months of fear, sorrow, and hope. Winter arrived softly, covering the camp in a thin layer of snow that muffled the usual sounds. The barracks glowed warmly in the mornings, and the pines seemed to bend protectively over the compound. Helga moved among the women, checking blankets, folding laundry, and occasionally stopping to listen to the radio. Jack worked beside her, maintaining the equipment, his hands steady, his presence a quiet reassurance. The days were still long, and letters continued to arrive for the German women, often from family who feared they would never hear from them again. Helga's brother had written again, offering small fragments of home, the smell of pine in the Bavarian forest, the laughter of children, the faint echo of church bells. She tucked the letters safely into her pocket, reading them often, each line a lifeline. One evening, after the last meal had been cleared and the barracks were hushed, Helga returned to the shack. The radio crackled softly, a distant German broadcast weaving through the static. She hesitated, then sat beside Jack. Want to hear it? He asked. Helga nodded. Together they listened to the voices from across the ocean, the melodies and news bridging continents. The war still raged beyond the camp, but here, in this small, snow-dusted corner of Tennessee, the division between enemy and ally had dissolved into something else entirely. Respect, understanding, even friendship, it had grown quietly, stubbornly, like the stubborn green shoots of spring beneath winter's frost. Jack looked at her and said softly, "We've made it through, together." Helga smiled, a warmth spreading through her that no winter chill could touch. "Yes," she whispered. "Together." As the snow fell, blanketing the camp in silence, Helga realized that this small, improbable connection, this shared humanity, was a victory of its own. And for the first time in months she allowed herself to hope, for life after war, for letters returned safely, for laughter, for music, and for the fragile, enduring bonds that had been born in the quietest moments of captivity. The radio hummed on. Outside, the wind stirred the pines. And in that moment, Helga felt the world shift, not with the roar of guns, but with the quiet courage of ordinary hearts reaching across impossible divides. The camp was no longer just a place of confinement. It was a sanctuary of understanding, a testament to the human spirit's capacity to heal, even amidst the lingering shadows of war.